Good afternoon and welcome to our Judges study. We're in Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. We've actually already had about 5 of these, and if you missed those, we have the text of some questions and discussion online, but we didn't record those with the video. So I'll be reading from the ESV, and if you want to get your Bibles and turn to Judges 2, whatever translation you have will be fine. Beginning in verse 11, we're seeing the people of Israel after the time of Joshua's death. I know it's kind of confusing because Judges 1:1 starts with Joshua already being dead, but then at the end of Judges chapter 1 and the beginning of Judges chapter 2, it goes back in time, kind of like a little memory of what had happened before Joshua died. And so we finished that yesterday and up to verse 10, where the angel of the Lord comes, condemns the people for not obeying God and not keeping the covenant like they were supposed to. And then they cry. They even name the place of weeping because of that. And they go away and they serve God the rest of the time that Joshua was alive and even the time that the people who outlived Joshua of his generation are alive. But now we come to a point where Joshua's dead and gone, Caleb's dead and gone, all of those older generation, even that were younger than Joshua and Caleb, are gone. And verse 11 pretty much sets the stage for everything that's going to take place in the rest of this book. We have the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. So here we have right off the bat, as soon as the leaders who are righteous people leave, they're dead and gone, the people turn away. Verse 12 even says, they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them and provoked the Lord to anger. So they didn't try to serve God and serve the Baals. They served the Baals and abandoned the Lord. They quit worshiping him altogether. So as we think about this, what a sad situation this is, but it's happened time and again with generations being lost. Now the Baals, notice that's plural. Usually Baal, we think of just like one, Baal. But there were several different Baals. Each of these little Canaanite groups had their own Baal that they worshiped. And they all had their own names, and each one was supposedly capable of doing various different things in their country and in their region. But they've provoked the Lord to anger. He's mad at them now. And this section is just a perfect summary of what the entire time, these hundreds of years during these times of the judges, what it was all like over and over again. There's a cycle that continues to happen over and over again. Verse 13 again, they abandoned the Lord and they served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. The Ashtaroth also, a lot of times Baal and Ashtaroth went together. The Baal was the male and the Ashtaroth was the female false god that they worshipped. And a lot of times these carried with it the idea of fertility and of crops growing, but also had some sexual connotations to them as well that people worshipped. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, verse 14 says, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. So we go from, in the last section, we talked about how they were defeating some of their enemies. They weren't defeating everybody, but they were sometimes putting those people in a position where they had to be servants, like slavery almost, or like taxing them heavily and things like that. But now we come to a point where that's not even happening. Instead, it's going the other way. Instead of them controlling the land and controlling the region and controlling all these other countries around them, all these other nations are starting to plunder them and starting to attack them, and they can't stand up against their enemies. And this is all because God's angry at them for their disobedience. Verse 15, whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. and they were in terrible distress. So God had promised them that if they would worship Him and obey Him and keep His commandments, He would fight for them. But He also told them, and this is all the way back into Deuteronomy even, if you reject me, if you deny me, if you disobey me and reject me and abandon me, then I'm going to turn on you. And so we see this starting to take place because they've turned on Him. God didn't break the covenant. They did. But once they broke the covenant, then the rest of these things are happening to them because of that. Verse 16, though, as much as God is angry with them, He still, verse 16 says, the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. So even as angry as God was, just like a parent might be angry at a child and punish that child, but the parent still loves that child and is trying to do good for that child, God would be angry at the people. He punished them. He let their enemies defeat them. But then He would still raise up what's called judges. And we talked about back in the very first lesson, are judges like the judges that we think of today that bang the gavel and sentence people to go to jail? No. What did we say the judges are?
Warriors.
Warriors. They're military leaders they're leading the people and taking them into battle and rescuing them. So that's what we have here. Verse 17, they did not listen to the judges. Now the judges, not only did they take them out in the military battle, but then they also became spiritual leaders a lot of times. And sadly, some of the judges were not very spiritual people and were not good at following God themselves, much less leading a nation to follow God. They didn't listen to the judges. They whored after other gods and bowed down to them. Now again, this kind of a sexual innuendo of the relationship between them and the other gods goes back to this idea of the Baals and the Ashtaroth, where there was a sexual aspect to it. But God considers it unfaithfulness, just like a husband or wife going out and having sexual relationship with someone they're not married to is unfaithful. God considered that to be an equivalent thing when people go and worship other gods other than Him. And so it's a horrible thing that they've done here. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. So their fathers had obeyed the commandments. They had been, remember, Joshua was conquering the land and leading the people in battle, and they were doing what God said for the most part. But He says they did not do so. Fathers had obeyed, but they did not. Verse 18 then, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with that judge, and He saved them from the hand of the enemies all the days of that judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. As angry as God was at them, and as much as He was letting them suffer, still, when they suffered, they'd cry out to Him. And He cared. And He would send a judge. And He would be with that judge. And for a while, they would be delivered during the days of that judge that God had raised up. They'd be saved from their enemies for that time. Verse 19, but when that judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So sometimes people say the book of Judges is a vicious cycle where it's just round and around in a circle. But really, it's more like they're circling the drain. Because as they go, they're just getting lower and lower and lower. It's not just the same cycle over and over and over in the same spot. Notice this. The judge comes, and all the days of that judge they're taken care of. But then when that judge dies, they don't just go back to where they were. They are more corrupt than the generation before them. So over a period of a few hundred years here, we have generation after generation. They'll get better for a little while this judge lives, and then the next generation, that judge will die, and that next generation will be even worse. And then a judge will come along and save them, and then the next generation will be even worse. And we'll see that as we move through the book. It gets to be total chaos. And if we remember kind of our theme verse, and I think Don talked about this with the little ones in their class, kind of the theme verse for the book of Judges is There was no king. God was supposed to be their king, but there wasn't. No king. No king in that day. And everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's our thing. And the problem is, what people think is right is not a good, safe standard to go by. Verse 20 then, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people has transgressed my covenant that I commanded them, their fathers, and that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. So these nations are there, and God's not going to just drive them out of the way as he had promised back in Joshua's day to do, because they're not obeying. And again, it's not that God's being unfair. They've brought it on themselves because of the way that they've acted. And then he says that the reason he's doing this in verse 22 is in order to test Israel by them, to see whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of, he had not given them into the hand of Joshua. And so here they are. They're stuck in this situation now. And the test, a little spoiler alert, they fail. They failed this test miserably. If the test was to see whether they were going to follow God and obey him, the answer is no. They're not going to. So that brings us to the end of this. Now, as we think about a couple of questions for us to think about here. If they were so wicked, why did God keep raising up a judge? Why did God not just wipe them out? Why did he keep turning back to them and letting them come back to him? Why did he keep protecting them? Why did he do that? Abigail?
Because he loved them.
Because he loved them. And so, even though he was angry at them, his love kept him wanting them to do what was right. Unfortunately, their love for him was not nearly as good as his love for them. Okay. And do any of you have any questions about what we talked about? What you got, Julia?
Why didn't they love God?
That is a good question. They should have, shouldn't they? I mean, after all he had done for them. I think we talked about this a little bit in the section yesterday that we didn't record. But remember it said there was a generation that came up that did not know God and did not know the mighty works that he had done for Israel. So I think they didn't love God because they didn't know who he was. Their parents hadn't told them and taught them how great God was. And so they just didn't know. I mean, it's kind of hard to really love somebody that you've never met or you don't know about or don't know who they are.
Or you don't remember them.
Or if you don't remember them. And that's it. They didn't remember God. And they didn't remember all the great things that he had done for their parents and their grandparents and on back. And so they started loving themselves and loving the people around them and started listening to those Canaanites. And it's a sad thing. Something we want to avoid, isn't it? We want to love God. We want to remember who he is and remember what great things he's done.
Why do you want to worship idols? Stupid dumb things. You can't even talk.
Well, that sounds like what Jeremiah said about them. They can't talk. They can't walk. They need somebody else to give them a bath. Can't do anything.
They can't do nothing. They can't even poop.
That's probably true. It's probably a good thing, or somebody would have to clean it up. All right. Well, we hope that this study of Joshua is beneficial, or Judges rather, is beneficial to you. And we're going to take a break now till tomorrow, and we'll be back tomorrow with starting Judges chapter 3. So thanks for joining.